Welcome to the DTN Ag Summit Series. I'm Farm Business Editor Katie Dellinger. Thank you so much for joining us. I am here today. We're going to be talking a lot about weather and markets, primarily, what's going on after that WASDE report last Monday when we had grain supplies that came in so large, that extra soybean crop. We're going to be talking today a lot about the role La Nina or the lack of La Nina played there. And so I'd like to introduce right now DTN Ag Meteorologist John Baranick. He's been covering this issue for us forever. It's really what he does. It's La Nina, El Nino, all of those things. When we were planning this event, we were talking a lot about how La Nina just didn't show up to the party this year. And it seems like perhaps she's going to. So, John, welcome to the studio. What's happening with La Nina?
Yeah, well, you're right, Katie. I mean, when we were looking at things, the last time I was here in front of y'all, it was February, and we were talking about it developing this summer. And it looked pretty positive that it was, and it just held off. We'll be talking about that and kind of what were the causes of why that kind of delayed itself for a bit. But we've enjoyed some pretty good weather across much of the country, because it's held off. So it's been kind of a good thing that it has.
Yeah. We just wrapped up the DTN Digital Yield Tour last week, where we looked at the crops from a variety of different angles, including some satellite-driven yield models that are proprietary to DTN, as well as with Todd Hultman's excellent market perspective and your weather forecast. What we really saw was that great weather throughout the growing season. It was wet in the spring in a lot of places, and that's where the issues with this growing season have generally stemmed from.
Right. Usually when we're talking about summer weather, we're talking about drought or which areas didn't get the rain. This year it's been all about who got too much, and so that's it's interesting to talk about. But every year has its issues, and this year it was too much rain in a few spots.
And farmers often tell me that it's a little bit easier to manage a crop in a drier year versus a wet one because of all those issues. And so every farmer I talk to for the Digital Yield Tour projects, and I'm sure the ones you talk to, and you will be talking to at all the farm shows, will be sharing all those little details of the weather, because it really does make a difference on those farms. Conditions are variable, but generally good. So within that range of good, there's another range of excellent to good.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you say good across the Corn Belt, but there's always spots that don't look that way. There's always going to be some spots that look good and other spots that don't look good within that. And that's just the variability of weather. And this is why we talk about it every time. So jump into it. All right. We'll jump into it. So, I just chose this picture because I thought it was pretty. There's nothing really interesting about it. It's just, we've had a lot of, auroras out there this year. So if you've seen the Northern Lights or if you've seen pictures of it, we've seen lots of it. A lot of my colleagues take pictures, and this is one of them they took. It's really pretty. So I just wanted to use it. But, we're going to talk about La Nina. Where did it go? But first, let's talk about really where we've been over the last, several months here. And in terms of temperatures, actually over the last 6 weeks or so, we got a nice break from some of the earlier warmth. June was a warm but not hot month for the most part, and it set off temperatures in a positive direction in terms of being above normal. But when we went through July and into August now, we saw a nice turn back in that, and it's been very comfortable for most of us here, unless you're out in Texas or in the West. So even parts of the South have stayed pretty hot as well. So we've had that over the course of this summer. It's also been pretty variable in the precipitation. If you look at there's a lot of green on that map east of the Rockies, and from coastal Texas all the way up into Minnesota and Wisconsin. Those are really the areas that we were mentioning just earlier about it got a little too wet, unfortunately. But you look, there's a lot of green on that map, and that's not something we typically see. Usually it's a couple patches here and there, but this year pretty widespread with the above normal precipitation. There's a couple of spots out there that didn't, right? You can see them on the map, especially around Ohio, and then down there in southwest Kansas, it's kind of patchy, but West Texas didn't get as much as they typically do over the last 90 days. But overall, you'd look at that map and say, well, we've got a pretty big crop coming. So, it's no surprise then when we look at the drought monitor, and this is the one from last week, because this week's won't be updated until Thursday. You don't have big areas, even small areas of drought across hardly any of the Corn Belt. You'd have to go into parts of Kansas, to really see any of that, and off in southern Ohio. And just the difference of where we've been over the last 3 months there. We had some drought kind of come in and go out, but if you add it all together from where we're at now, we actually saw reductions in drought across Iowa. We had some kind of those really big deficits from prior years of drought still hanging on this summer, and we've been able to eliminate those. And then even Kansas, the drought was worse. So some of that patchy rainfall that was good turned out to reduce some of the drought there. But you can see how southern Ohio and into West Virginia there has not had the rainfall. And if not for Tropical Storm Debbie, the southeast would be a lot drier out there too. So we've had a lot of things just going on, and mostly in the positive direction. And so when you look at this is just a time series of the area of the corn, of U.S. corn estimated to be in drought. And over the last 6 weeks, we've been in single digits, whereas you look back to last year, and it's 40, 50, even 60% of the corn was in drought at this time or into September. So we're sitting in a much better spot than we were last year in terms of drought. And there's other ways we can look at it. We're looking at soil moisture rate here, and I apologize, it's a couple days old because the government's a little slow. But we've got all the blues on there are above normal, and we're just looking at topsoil moisture right now. There are some dry spots. This is just before the rain came in last week over the eastern corn belt, so that's why that looks drier. But they've had some pretty good rainfall here over the last week. You can still see kind of what happened with Debbie there in the Carolinas. And then, that's a lot of blue over a lot of big corn acres. And you look at the subsoil moisture too, and, there's not those big, dark red areas that we've seen in previous years where we've got just really stuck in drought and long-standing drought. Any drought that's out there right now is pretty transient, so that's also good news. Even those areas in the eastern corn belt that are drier, I mean, even at the subsurface levels, it's dry, but it's not super dry. It's not that that really dark red area. So most areas are in good shape. Obviously, Minnesota and northern Iowa kind of poke out at you right there in terms of being above normal. And that's obviously led to some issues with flooding and uneven stands and all the good fun business that happens with that. Talking to a farmer down in Albert Lea, which is in southern Minnesota, and he showed me pictures of the 4th of July where there's just giant pond in the middle of his field, and then he showed me a picture from 3 weeks later and still there. So obviously people are having some issues with that. So but overall, it's pretty good. Here's another. I mean, there's so many ways you can look at soil moisture, and they're all just a little bit different. But even here, even the areas that look dry on this map, and this one's a month old again because government. But it's even the drier areas aren't that bad. It's just out in southern Ohio, which doesn't have a whole lot of corn acres, or in the mountains in West Virginia. So overall, it's still looking pretty good. So I think we're in a pretty good spot. The only issue I see, other than the overall wetness, was the severe weather. And this is every severe report for the year. And so there's a lot of dots on there. And it's widespread. It's not some areas got it and some areas didn't. It's pretty widespread. You have to go up to the Dakotas in northern Minnesota to really get away from the severe weather, at least in the Corn Belt. And it's been quite significant. If you look at the tornado reports here, the red line is where we're at. The black solid line is the average over the last 15 years, and only 2011 is higher than that. Some folks down south might be remembering what happened in 2011 with a big outbreak there in April that really shot off the reports for that year. But I mean, outside of that, we're running the most confirmed tornado reports in the last 15 years. So it's been pretty significant. Hail, not so much, and we have had areas that have had hail and damage with that. Hasn't been a significant hail year this year, though. A lot of the systems that have been moving through, so we haven't had that hail really stack up in certain areas. We haven't had the super heat that is sometimes required, especially out in the western plains there, to really bump up those numbers. But I mean, we've had plenty of hail. And the wind damage has been the other thing. We've had all sorts of wind issues throughout the Corn Belt, throughout the entire year. And so it's been kind of widespread, really following the trend pretty closely, but definitely above normal. And that just doesn't, that includes these derecho events as well. So we've had about 5 of them. It says 4, but the third one down is actually 2 separate things. So we had, the one right at the bottom there is the one that we're probably the most concerned about and a little bit more interested in, to see exactly how that one developed, or how that one will affect yields this year. It developed in Iowa, went through northern Illinois and into Indiana, very similar to what happened in 2020. I have a blog out on DTNPF, DTNPF.com, I should say that, about kind of comparing and contrasting those two. Luckily, this one wasn't as damaging as the one from 4 years ago, but it was kind of interesting to me, at least, that it kind of developed in the exact same spot and went through the same areas. And so we'll see if that has any effect when farmers go out into the fields. A lot of that corn was able to stand right back up. But so now, big topic of the day, where are we sitting at with temperatures in the Pacific Ocean? That's the biggest driver of our weather. And so let's take a look at that. Again, this is from last week. This isn't from this week, because they just didn't update it yesterday when they were supposed to. So we don't have those. I don't have those numbers for you. So this is a week old, but we're sitting there in that box around that Nino 3.4 region is the region we look at, and the box below shows you kind of where in the world that is. It's right there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right along the equator. You might be able to see Mexico and South America on the right, and then Australia on the left. And that black box is what we're looking at. So it's actually a really small area that we're looking at, but it means has a huge impact on really global weather. And so we're sitting at neutral right now. You can see on the time series there how we've gone from a pretty big El Nino over the last winter down into this kind of neutral category. And when we look and see where we're looking at, this is where we're looking at. We also look at some other things around here. So really what goes on at the equator has a big impact on global weather, not just that black box there where we're looking at for El Ninos and La Ninas, but some of those other areas in the Indian Ocean as well. And so that's a little active out there in the Indian Ocean. That's kind of driving some of our weather as well. And you notice that black box is pretty empty. And you'll notice there's not a whole lot of cloud cover there. There's not a whole lot of thunderstorms in there. And that's because waters are starting to cool down there. We just look at the latest data here, and we see that it's a little bit on the warm side there in the east, or in the west, closer to Australia, and in the east there's some pockets of cool water poking up, so that kind of averages out to 0. But when we look down through the ocean, this is where it really gets interesting, and a really big reason why we were thinking La Nina was going to be here. If you look at that, it looks like there's a lot of blue water or cold water near the surface. The black box is that Nino 3.4 region. And at the top is the surface layer of water, and then as you go down is how far deep you are in the ocean. You notice there's a big pool of cold water that's just below the surface, and it just hasn't really broken up to the top just yet. It's been sitting there. It's been sitting there all summer, which is why a lot of models had La Nina starting the summer. It just has not materialized. And at the risk of being a little too confusing for you, I put up a couple of maps here to kind of describe really what's gone on over the summer season that limited La Nina's development. And what you're looking at, if you look at the map on the left, that's sea surface temperatures or upper ocean heat content is what it's labeled at. But basically, you average out the water temperatures there in about 50 meters from the surface. And those dotted lines in there are, or I should mention there, you're looking back in time on these maps. So if you look at the top of the map, it's what's happened back in I think it's April or September of last year. And then if you go down to the bottom, that's currently where we're at. And so when you see these dotted lines, you're actually watching something move from west to east over time. And so what we're looking at here then is we've got a couple of these dotted lines that have moved up or moved through back in the winter and the spring. That eliminated our El Nino, but it didn't completely bring us into La Nina. You'll notice right there at the bottom there, So this is currently, we're seeing this other wave in the ocean bring up that colder water now, just over the last couple of weeks. On the right-hand side, again, we're looking at a time stamp, but this also has a forecast to it. This time we're not looking at ocean temperatures, we're looking at winds. So really what we look at for El Niños and La Niñas are not just ocean temperatures, but also the winds. What are the winds doing? Because when El Niño's around, the winds are kind of relaxed, they're not moving. They may even move eastward, which is unusual. Usually around the equator, winds move from east to west instead of west to east where we live. And so when they're moving the opposite way, that tends to pool up that warm water at the surface. It doesn't push it around, so it stays warmer there. But during La Nina, those winds are increased quite a bit, and it really pushed those cold waters westward towards Australia, and it brings up that cold water from below. And so that's what gives us the cold water. So the map on the right, that red box, is showing the same thing, time series, but those orange and reds in there are actually westerly winds. So what we're seeing there is, instead of moving from east to west, they're moving from west to east. So they're keeping that surface water intact, not allowing that cold water to come up. But you see right below that solid black line is the forecast, and you see all these blues in there. So those are enhanced winds then that will push all this warm water that's sitting at the top west towards Australia, and then we'll be able to pull up that cold water from below. So we're starting to do that in two different areas. We're doing that at the ocean level by itself within the ocean, and then also now with the winds coming up here going into September. So we should expect La Nina conditions to start popping up here pretty soon. And if we look at the models, they've really been doing this all summer. It's kind of interesting. You see that pause there right through June and July, where they kind of held steady. It just started to drop here over the last couple of weeks. And the CFS model here is our American climate model, and it really has us taking a dive. I don't know if it'll get that strong. It does appear to be down to the minus 1.5 area. It's probably a little too aggressive. However, there is some pretty cold water down there to pull up, so that it would be possible. Other models, and these didn't update here for August yet. They update actually on Thursday, so we'll get them then. But they show the same idea. We have us dipping into La Nina. They're not as strong as our CFS model is, but we do see dipping into La Nina here over the fall, into the winter, and then coming back up into neutral for spring. And if you notice, I'll go back one. The CFS model was doing that as well. So we have going back up into neutral category next spring. So should be, or at least it's forecast to be, a pretty brief event, pretty brief La Nina. We had some in our history going back where we've had several in a row. You go back to 2020, and we had 3 straight winters of La Nina there on the right. You can see in blue, and a couple of them were pretty strong. And then we popped right back into a super El Nino, and then we're headed back towards La Nina. So our history here has been really muddled with wide swings in ocean temperatures the last several years. And down below that, just a reminder of what La Nina does to the atmosphere during the wintertime, and not during the fall, but during the wintertime, we'll see this kind of pattern lock up a little bit more often than normal, as we'll get this variable jet stream, puts a really big high pressure off in the Pacific Ocean, and it pushes the jet stream up to Alaska. And what goes up must come down, so it comes down, unfortunately, for some of us in the north central U.S., making it pretty cold. So we get bigger shots of cold air, longer lasting shots of cold air, but it doesn't normally penetrate all the way down to the south very often, and so that actually ends up to be drier and warmer down in the south. You notice that any wet conditions are on the Pacific coast or in the Ohio Valley, but they're kind of small areas. So that's typically what La Nina will do to us during the wintertime. So that's the pattern we're going to be kind of looking for in the future. So, we've had all these wild swings of temperatures if in the Pacific Ocean. And if we go back to, the previous years where we've had these super El Ninos, they've been followed by 2 La Ninas. So this is no surprise to us. We were expecting this once we saw that El Nino was going to happen. So it's just been kind of interesting that it's taken so long. So what's interesting about this year is that it's forecast to just happen once. We'll have to see what happens for the following year and see if La Nina comes back. It did back in 2016 and in 17, where we had a rise back up to normal, and then we went back down into La Nina again. So we'll see if that happens. But be prepared to hear a lot about La Nina coming up. But it's not the only thing that affects our weather, right? I mean, it's just one part of the world's oceans, and it might have the biggest effect, but it's only one. I just listed a whole bunch of other things here that also affect our weather. I'm not going to go through them. Just to say that, they all happen at different time scales. The ones at the top are on shorter time scales. They move around a lot more often. The ones at the bottom take decades to actually do it. But there's all different kinds of things, and we're still learning about more that occur in our atmosphere and in the oceans that really drive different weather patterns. And so we're learning about these sorts of things all the time, and we're getting better at it. But it's hard to do a forecast. So when we do a forecast, we're making a lot of assumptions. We're assuming that La Nina is going to happen. It's going to have a huge impact on our weather. And if it doesn't, then the forecast doesn't look so good. But assuming that La Nina is coming, and it does appear that it's right on the cusp, and it's starting to occur right now. Bryce Anderson actually has a blog out today about that happening, so you can check out his blog. But what we look at for a fall forecast, and if you add up every day, September 1st and November 30th, this is what we're expecting. So not a lot of detail in here, but fairly warm conditions, which is good for getting out there to go harvest, and overall rather dry. We're not super dry up there in the northern plains or the Canadian prairies. We may have a signal for some above normal precipitation there, but further down the coast or further down south you get, the drier we have it. And if we break that down kind of month by month there, one interesting thing I think that pops out when we talk about La Ninas developing is what happens in October. And in a couple of those years, what we've seen is a very strong push of cold air early in October. Both in 2012 and 2020, we had one of those developing. I know a lot of folks up there in the Dakotas and Minnesota had to plant late, and or replant because of flooding or some other reason. And the crop is a little bit further behind. And if we get a cold shot in October, we could be talking about an early frost, or at least a killing frost that could have some major damage. So that would be the one thing that I think screams out of the very warm period we're expecting here for the fall, is that could have a big impact for those of us up in the Northwest. Other than that, we don't have a very good signal of wetter conditions occurring. We have some here in September, and we've been quite active recently. We're going through a couple week period of some drier weather. That's not great, but we've got the soil moisture in most areas, so I think we'll be okay. But at least in September, we don't have a huge dry signal outside of Texas and the far southern Gulf Coast. So overall, I think if you're still needing some rain to finish your crop, I think we're going to be okay for the most part. And then when we get into October and November, it dries out pretty nicely for most areas outside of the far north. So I think that bodes well for a lot of us for getting out there and harvesting. Or if you need to plant your winter wheat, I think the planting goes well. It's not great for getting a lot of soil moisture in there prior to the winter season, but it is at least letting you get out there and do some field work. The other thing we have to do, though, is it's fall season, and we have to talk about hurricanes. What we see, the main period here is August, September, and October. That's when we see our peak hurricane season. We already had Tropical Storm Debbie dump a whole bunch of rain on the East Coast, and we're expecting a whole bunch more. So what we normally see is after August 1st, we see multiples storm systems out there in the Atlantic. And we're expecting that to continue to be the case. I think we'll be on the upper end of some of these ranges, even though we've had somewhat of a slow start. And the DTN forecast is for 23 named storms. We've only gotten through Ernesto. So we've only gotten through 5 so far. Means we've got a lot coming up. And so some of these could be moving into the Gulf Coast, into the east, maybe bringing some rain up into the eastern Midwest. So we'll have to be watching that carefully too. So even though we're expecting a dry overall fall season, all it takes is one tropical system to really screw that up. So we'll be watching that. So now that we get into winter, we're looking at, how's the winter going to be? Are we going to be able to, are we worried about winter kill for our winter crops if you have them? Are we looking at, recharging our soil moisture? What we're looking at here for the fall again, or for the winter, December 1st through February 28th, add them all up and average them. Overall warm, but you can notice there in the kind of the Pacific Northwest up into the Canadian prairies, it's colder than normal up there. And I'm expecting some of those shots of cold air to move down into the north central U.S. this winter. Also on the precipitation forecast, again, we're following a pretty typical La Nina pattern. Very warm and dry across the south. You got that pocket of better precipitation in the Ohio Valley and up in the Pacific Northwest. This is a combination of history and models. It's not just us throwing stuff up on the board there. So this is what we see during La Ninas. This is what the models are projecting, and all that blended together gives us a pretty good shot that La Nina is the typical La Nina pattern is going to be present. And if we go through kind of the forecast for the winter, we don't really see that big push of cold air come in until usually late in January or especially in February. February is just the hot button month for getting a really blasted shot of cold air to come in. Dakotas, Minnesota, the 30 to 40 below kind of cold shot that could last, a good week and days below zero lasting for a week or two. That's pretty typical in February. That's what we're forecasting is a pretty good cold shot there in February. And then that La Nina precipitation pattern really picks up there in January and February. You notice where it gets really dry down in the south and picking up the precipitation in the Ohio Valley. So as far as snowfall, that leaves northern areas kind of average. We don't have a good signal either way that we'll have a lot of snow cover or we might not. La Nina 2 years ago dumped a whole bunch of snow across the upper Midwest. I had 100 inches in my yard over the season, which was double what we typically get. So that was a lot of fun. So we can get one of these really rough winters where we get pounded with some of these storm systems. We'll see if that adds up to above normal snowfall or not as we get deeper into the year. And so now that we kind of look at what's going on for North America, for us here in the U.S., let's head down south because that's going to be where we need to turn our attention to. Our season's starting to wind down. Down there is going to start ramping up here in the next month. So La Nina doesn't just affect us here in the U.S., it affects everybody around the world pretty much. And circle down there in Argentina and southern Brazil, you'll notice some drier patches. And so we expect that to come back in for them. Drier weather has been a menace down there in Argentina during La Ninas, and they had 3 straight years of it where they had some pretty poor crops. Last year they lucked out and had a pretty good one, but they might be sitting in a bad spot down there. And if you kind of look at soybean production, I just circled those or blocked off those La Nina years. They kind of follow a trend line a little bit for soybeans. Soybeans aren't as affected by it as corn is. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but we did see a pretty big drop off there right in the middle. If it was 21 and 22, thank you for that. I can't read the screen, but that's great. And they're not starting off here in South America under very good conditions. This is a look at soil moisture. It's estimated from satellite. It's not great, but it does give us a picture. There's a lot of red on both in both countries right now. Argentina didn't have a very good winter season. Not a whole lot of rainfall. They don't typically get a lot of snowfall anyway, but they haven't had a whole lot of precipitation this winter, and it's left a lot of areas dry. There's only a couple of patches around that have good soil moisture at the moment. Brazil, much the same. That far southern state of Rio Grande do Sul got flooded out in early May. They've had a couple of really big events since then that kept their soil moisture kind of normal-ish. They went through some pretty wild swings of being super wet, then very dry, and then super wet again. So they've had some big issues down there for their wheat, but it's also kind of messed with their soil moisture a bit. And you notice just all that red across central and southern Brazil. And that is the prime growing area for soybeans and corn where they double crop down there. and it's typically they're in their wet, dry season anyway, and you don't expect any rainfall, but they ended their season very early last year. It's been super hot over the winter, and so their soil moisture is just nothing there. So they need those rains to start really quickly. And what we see again during La Niñas is drier conditions down there in Argentina and far southern Brazil. So they're going to see some issues with that. You might notice just a little bit of a dry patch there in central Brazil, and that's usually the delayed start to their wet season. So they really depend on that wet season for allowing them to grow 2 full crops of soybeans and then corn. And what we see circled here are the La Nina years in blue, and that red bar down the middle is the typical start date for the start of their wet season rains in central Brazil, which is the last few days of September. But during La Niñas, that pushes a little bit further back into October. So they come in a little bit later, they get planted a little bit later, and that, depending on if that occurs, which is more likely to happen, then they could be talking about a shorter planting window and for getting their soybeans in. And that really screws things back up on the other side as well, because if you notice here on the tail end, the end of their wet season usually ends sooner in their fall, which would be our spring, in April or early May. Typically, it's the first few days of May where you see those last couple of really big rains. But during La Niñas, it's usually sometime in April. And even last year's El Nino had that ending in April. So if you have a late start and an early end, you got a really, really short window, really tight window to have good weather conditions. They can't have any significant delays when they're going to harvest their soybeans and plant their corn. They're going to have to do it right away. And they're going to just pray that the rainfall continues well into April, and hopefully for them into May, so that they can have a good corn crop as well. The likelihood of that happening is not very high, though. So here's what we're looking at for the spring season forecast for them. Remember, our fall's their spring. And you notice that temperatures are pretty warm. They're going to continue to be warm through the fall season. But notice how dry it is. We don't have any green on that map. It's all either normal or drier than normal. Specifically calling out southern Brazil on that, and then even central Brazil has a pretty good dry period in there. A lot of that is due to the late start of their wet season, we believe. So when we go through the summer and how things are feeling, a lot of heat going on there, especially in Argentina. So they had a big issue in January of this year where they had a big burst of heat, and what looked great all of a sudden just turned out okay. So they got a big burst of heat that kind of screwed things up for them. We've got a higher chance of that happening again this year. Very dry there. Just notice how dry it is there in Argentina and far southern Brazil. So they're going to have some issues, I think, here for their soybean crops down in far southern Brazil, maybe not for central Brazil. Even if they're drier in central Brazil, they average 8 to 12 inches of rain a month. So if you're a little bit drier than that, it's not so bad. The only issues you have are if those dry stretches kind of are a little bit longer. But overall, we're not anticipating that for central Brazil. So it's really southern Brazil and Argentina we'll be probably keying in on over the next several months, and for areas to watch going forward. So that's all I had for us, Katie. I think we'll head it back to you for just a second.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, thanks, John. I thought that was really interesting talking about it. I know, you've got this beautiful picture of the auroras here. We've had a weird geomagnetic year. There have been a couple of these storms that have knocked out GPS and done some other things. As a meteorologist, is that just kind of nerd fodder for you?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I just like, because it was amazing, because I got to go out on my deck back in May, and I just watched it happen over my house. I didn't have to go anywhere. It was just right off my
We saw
my
pink
house.
auroras in Tennessee, where I live, which I don't
Very
think
cool.
that it rarely ever gets down there. So it was one of those a unique thing about the summer, kind of along with some of these trends we've been talking about. So For all of you that are watching, please, if you have any questions for John, drop them in the Q&A. We're going to be doing a joint Q&A with John and Todd after Todd gives his presentation, because we found over the years that that's really just one of the best ways to talk about the markets and weather together and really have a good conversation, is to do that joint Q&A. So please, if you have any questions for John, drop them in the Q&A section on Zoom, so I can look at those and make sure we've got those ready to go for after Todd's presentation. We're going to take a really quick break right now to bring Todd on set to talk a little bit more about the markets and the implications of last week's WASDE report. Hang on, we'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm DTN Farm Business Editor with right here in studio with DTN Lead Analyst Todd Hultman. I forgot my name. I knew I forgot a word in there. I'm Katie Dellinger. I was getting ahead of myself. I'm excited to be here with Todd Hultman. I've known Todd here for more than a decade through our work here at DTN. I've learned a lot of what I know about the markets from Todd and his predecessors and his team. And it's something that we're really proud of here at DTN, is the way we analyze and look at the grain markets using our 6-factor strategies. Todd, I know that there has been a lot going on in this space, and it's not something a lot of producers are very happy with right now.
No, pain is the number one point, I think, this year. And it's been quite a while, at least 4 years, since we've seen prices at this unprofitable of a level for corn and soybeans. And there hasn't been a lot of opportunities through the year, to be honest. So it's been a very tough year. Can't put lipstick on a pig. It's probably going to still be a tough road ahead. But I'll try to give you an understanding today of just what some of the opportunities are of how to at least get a better price, if not the price we would all want.
You know, I spoke with a grower in southern Indiana last week, and we were talking about this, being excited about big yields and depressed about prices and sort of the conflict that comes with that. And I asked him, what would you have to grow in order to break even? And he laughed and he was like, I'd have to grow 280 bushels an acre to break even at 450.
Tough. Yeah.
But then he proceeded to say to me that he made it through the 80s. He's been through the last commodity bust. He knows he's more concerned about young producers without a lot of equity out there, and it is an equity game at this point as far as that financial concern. But I like what you said earlier about how to make the best price you can, even if it's not the price you want or the price you need.
Yeah. And I share his concern about young producers. That's really been on my heart this year. They have the toughest road. They've got the biggest expenses. They're more reliant on debt than the older.
They rent more ground.
They rent more ground, so it's tough all around. Mm-hmm. And obviously, we need them to be there in the future for us. We still want some food coming our way, but it's a tough time to get through. Not the first time we've been through this, so hang in there. I hope we can.
Yeah. Well, with that, why don't you go ahead and take us away on our conversation today about where the markets are.
Very good. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Katie. All right. Well, I'd like to start with kind of a big picture perspective and just what are the main factors that are pushing the prices right now. And of course, as John described to you in detail, we've had mostly favorable weather across the Midwest. The main exceptions to that, I would point out, have been all the severe weather damage that we've had throughout the year. And as John described again, whether it was from tornadoes or other wind damage, we have had some big hail patches, especially in Nebraska, had a big area hit hard by hail. And of course, I'm in South Dakota, and we had quite extensive flooding in June in southeastern South Dakota, northwest Iowa. And of course, Minnesota's kind of been just its whole unique set of problems this year with parts of Wisconsin attached to that. But overall, we can't deny, you look at the map and we've got the most favorable soil moisture situation across the Midwest we've seen in at least 4 years. And so there is a bit of silver lining, as you say. There's going to be a lot of good yields out there, even though prices are tough. The unique thing, I think, about this year compared to most recent years is that we still have a Fed policy that's quite hawkish. And of course, their national effort is to keep prices down, but the interest rate and the Fed policy does not affect everybody the same. And so going again, thinking about those young producers that are having a tough time even getting close to their break-even levels, and maybe they have they're trying to pay off equipment or pay down on their operating note, the Fed policy really hits them hard as well and raises the cost of production for all of us. And that Fed policy isn't changing very quickly, as you all notice here. We also have specs near record levels, holding net short positions. That actually goes along with the Fed policy as well. Not only, in the big cycle of grain, we have years where grain is scarce, and we've seen that for a few years. And now we're back into a time when the supplies are more in surplus. And of course, that's naturally bearish for prices, and we've been through that several times before. But then you add to that a Fed policy that has raised the interest rate and made it a national goal to bring the general price level down. And that just encouraged fund managers from across the country to put on big short positions. So since rates started going up in about early 2022, we've seen specs start to load on the net short positions. And we'll talk about that more in just a bit. But that also has added a bearish influence to our prices. And then the other thing I have to mention, just last week, we hear about a proposal from the California Air Resources Board, and they're proposing, I should say, severe limitations on the amount of soybean oil and canola that can be used in the process of making renewable diesel. And of course, they're going to govern that by who's eligible for the tax credit in California. And so this hopefully will not have a dramatic short-term effect, but for anyone that's an existing supplier and already has a pathway of delivering bean oil and or canola to that market come 2028, they're going to be limited to 20% of their company's production. So that is a bit of disappointing news, I think, for the long-term future of what has been a very healthy and important renewable diesel market for soybean prospects. Lastly, the best news, I think, through all of this is that there's just no argument. The demand for cheap corn and soybeans is doing very well at these lower prices, and that's good news. We've seen years before when there were problems with international demand specifically, and those became even worse situations than what we're living through now. So thank goodness we do have very active demand for the cheap level in corn and beans. It's just going to take a while, I think, for the market to show more appreciation for that. All right. One thing I want to make a comment about on the interest rate picture, here again we have a chart of the yields on the 10-year T-notes, which is kind of the private market's view of where interest rates should be. And you can see that those anticipations have been coming down. So the rate on the 10-year T-note has been coming down the last few months. And that's gone along with easing inflation. They're getting closer to that 2% Fed target level. That's maybe the good news on the side of hoping that we can get some rate cuts here pretty soon, probably a 0.25% rate cut in September, but it's the ones that follow that we're going to be most concerned about. That rate expectation has been tied very closely, as I've talked about for a long time since COVID, to the crude oil price. And we had a very difficult time producing crude oil and getting it back to where we were before COVID for several years. And now we're finally back not only above where we were at on the production side, but we're actually nudging into record levels. We had 13.4 million barrels a day not too long ago. And that's helped really take a lot of the pressure off the top side of crude oil prices. The catch, however, is still the situation in the Middle East. So as long as Iran remains an active threat in the Middle East and continues to attack Israel through its surrogates, we have a potential problem. And that worry has been holding up the crude oil price. I think it would have been coming down easier without that situation. So that remains the one hindrance roadblock, I would say, to expecting much cheaper interest rates ahead. But there is room for rates to come down, and that's a bit of good news. Okay, here's those spec positions I'm talking about. This chart of the red line is the CFTC data. If we looked at non-commercial positions, and I've added up corn, soybeans, and Chicago wheat here just to get a feel for what specs are doing in the market. And as you can see on the left-hand side, in the 2000s, we had very small swings in that. But then the CFTC, over a number of years, has raised the position limits. So they raised in 2005, they raised in 2013. And if you look at the very top peak on the right-hand side, the CFTC increased position limits in October of 2020. And we wrote about that at DTN at the time. And my comment was, the tough thing about this is that when we return someday to bearish markets and have more surplus and supply in the market, it's going to exaggerate prices to the downside. And I think we're seeing that today. As you can see, we reached, earlier this year in February, we reached new record levels of net short positions in those three contracts we had never seen before. We've since lightened that positions has lightened up a little bit since then, but it still continues to be a very heavy position on the market. And that, as I said again, you can tie that somewhat to Fed policy, but also the return of surplus markets. So it's a very tough spot we're in right now. If there is one good thing about this, it's that when specs are heavily short, they're often also very vulnerable to a bullish surprise. Well, unfortunately, the weather being as good as it has been this year, we really haven't had a strong bullish surprise in the market. But if you notice, there was a previous short peak back in April of 2019. And of course, that was right before the year it just started raining and never quit during the planting season. And that was one time where the specs really got their hat handed to them on that, and they had to cover. And of course, eventually went net long. So I just want to point out again that yes, specs are a big force in the market. They have a lot of money. They can push prices, but they're not always right. And they're often vulnerable when they're most vulnerable at times when they put on their biggest positions. And so that's one thing that we have to keep in mind here. All right, let's get a start here taking a look at corn for the year. And I start asking the question, just how bad is it? So this is a chart that I've kept over the years, and I think it's important for a historical perspective to give us a sense of how we compare to other previous years. Right now, using USDA's cost of production estimates, the December corn price is 18% below the production cost. Now, I know a lot of people, whenever I present a chart like this, they'll say, well, big deal, the market doesn't care about production costs, and traders certainly don't care about production costs. And you're absolutely right, and in the short term, there's no law that says that the market has to have any respect for production costs. But I found that this is really, I think, the most effective and best way of comparing prices over time. You know, the value of the dollar changes over time, the ability of our yield potential changes over time, but we can compare prices versus the production costs over a number of years and get an impression of just how painful it was in those years. If you notice, at 18% below cost, we're down near the lowest end of the range that we've been at since 2007. And I find that important because, of course, that was the year that the ethanol industry was started by with the signature of President Bush. And I think it's no small matter or secret to point out that the origination and support and encouragement of ethanol production has been the number one best influence for ag profitability in my lifetime that we've seen. If you notice the values before 2007, we had times when things got much worse than 20% below the production costs. And of course, the two most bearish events in my lifetime were 1986-87, when we had huge surpluses of corn. And on the chart, you can see we got down near 40% below cost. And the other time was the Asian recession of roughly 1919 to 2000. We lost some of our best customers. So in comparison, I would again point out that I'd much rather have a corn market with a bit of a surplus, but good, healthy demand versus the situation we had in 2000 where we lost a lot of our best customers through that period. So I think that's one real positive that we have going for us in the current situation. We still have production to be determined. There's a crop tour going on this week. You're going to hear all kinds of yield guesses. We had our own DTN yield tour, but typically it's hard to get a very solid production estimate until you get to about October. The ranges of guesses start tightening down. So we're not quite there yet. It's still a little bit early to be too confident on just what production is. But obviously, we're back to a surplus market, and that's no secret. Oops. I mentioned demand. Here's the corn export pace that for the current season, 2023 to 24, we're just about at the end of. As of August 8, our old crop corn sales exceed already USDA's export estimate. It's just a matter of getting those sales shipped, and the shipment pace has been right on track. So we may come in maybe even a little bit above by the time we get to the end of the month. On this chart, the red line is our current pace. The green shaded area is last year. Obviously, it was much more difficult to sell $6.50 corn than it is to sell corn below $4, and that's helping us keep pace. We're not quite at the 4-year average, which is the black line, and frankly, that's going to be tough to achieve as Brazil continues to expand production year after year. That continues to be a bearish headwind in both our corn and soybean markets. But one good thing for us at the moment, the U.S. corn price is the cheapest among the top competitors, even cheaper than Ukraine at this point because they've had some dry weather problems this year. Ethanol margins are fantastic right now. If you're an ethanol plant, congratulations, you've got a great market going. And there's nothing like cheap corn to make the value at the ethanol plant highly in your favor. The blue line on here is corn's processing value from Iowa. This is a USDA estimate. Comes out every Monday, and you can see on the chart we've got a pretty wide margin there. And basically, it's the value of ethanol and distiller grains and corn oil that comes from producing a bushel of corn. Excuse me. And with corn prices as cheap as they are, the demand for corn for producing ethanol continues to be very strong. We're up roughly 3.6% from a year ago. This is a chart I like to bring up for comparison. Excuse me. So this is looking at the bearish year history for corn. We're basically going from 2015 to 2020. And during this time, we also had corn surpluses in the neighborhood of 2 billion bushels or more. We had ending stocks to use ratios from roughly 13 to 16%. Today's USDA is estimating just under 14%. So we fit in this little scenario quite well. The difference being that our production costs are about 29% higher this year than they were at that time. But I wanted to use this chart to point out that even in bearish years and times of surplus, there is still volatility to the market, and there will still likely be some rally opportunities. And so basically going from the 2014 low here, we see that corn rallied 27% in 2017. It got up 32%, sorry, having a hard time seeing that, 32% from 2018. These are some of the heaviest surplus years. So even though, yes, the fundamentals are bad, the weight of the market is down on prices, there are things that happen throughout the year that often give opportunities. Now, of course, I can't guarantee that we're going to have a 27% rally this year, but just taking that as the most conservative scenario, so far December corn's hit 390 low. If we increase that by 27%, we get a 495 target. So again, I can't guarantee that we're going to get to 495 in the season ahead, but those are reasonable type expectations that we will see some sort of volatility in front of us. The crop insurance math for 2024, well, as rough as it's been, we've finally reached the level where crop insurance is going to kick in, I think, for a lot of folks. The February average of $4.66 a bushel, if you got an 85% revenue protection program, that puts your protection around $3.96, assuming an average yield this year. And of course, there's going to be a lot of variability when it comes to the yields in different parts of the country this year, but our current price is roughly $4. We're very close to that crop insurance level. So we'll have to see how that turns out in October, but as far as risk management goes for the moment, we are down near the lower end. Now, thinking about what to do with that corn moving forward, typically, what we try not to do is sell right out at harvest time, because you're going to get the worst basis. You're going to get the worst of all worlds. And basically, from I'd say the past several weeks into harvest time, all the focus of the market is just on how much is being produced. And of course, we're going to hear big yields, and we're going to hear big crop production numbers. When we get past harvest, then the focus starts to shift more to, well, what's the demand like? How much is this corn moving out? And typically, what we normally see, even in bearish years, is an improvement in the basis levels from that harvest low, typically in October. And for corn, we can see improvement up until March or April before it starts feeling a threat from South America. So I think it's basically that period where we're going to have a chance at least trying to get a modestly better price. I can't guarantee that we're going to get production costs this year, unfortunately, but there's always room for surprise. You never know. And there'll be a lot of attention on what early conditions look like in Brazil, I'm sure. Here's one more reason I would suggest that I think support is probably near, especially for the December corn price, and that is we can wrap an envelope around the 1-year moving average, and typically what you see, and this history goes back much farther than this chart shows, but typically you'll see that December corn prices trade plus or minus 16% from the 1-year average. Now, when we had the big surge in 21 and 22, it got much higher, even than the 16% premium over the 1-year average. But on the downside, and especially when you get at these cheaper prices, 16% is kind of the typical range of volatility for corn prices. So if you couple that with where we're at on our unprofitability level also, both of those are suggesting that we should be close to the lower end of the market. But again, I'm too old to know that we can't offer guarantees. I wish I was naive enough to believe I could. All right, soybeans. Going to take a similar look here, and here once again is the profitability glance on soybeans. And just like December corn, November soybeans are 18% below USDA's production cost at their current levels. And we have not seen that level of unprofitability since 2018 and 2019. And of course, that's the time when we were in a trade dispute with China and they quit buying soybeans for a while, and we lost some demand in that situation. We also saw our ending stocks go up over 900 million bushels for a short time during that trade dispute. We're nowhere close, in my mind, to the bearishness of that situation. We still have reasonably good demand for soybeans, and the picture's starting to look better. I'll talk about that in just a minute. The current ending stocks to use ratio, even with USDA estimating a record crop this year and a record yield, we're looking just under 13% of annual use. So that's in 560 million bushels of ending stocks. So of course, that's nowhere close to 900 million bushels of ending stocks. Just for sake of history, if you notice, the toughest time again for soybeans was during the Asian recession, that 1919 to 2001 period. And the worst thing really that can happen to a market is losing demand. Supplies usually work themselves out over time, but thank goodness we have a good demand situation at the moment for soybeans. This has been the shipment pace on soybeans. That's the red line. If you notice, we were staying close to last year's place in the 4-year average up until about Thanksgiving time. That's when Brazil started to get some rain, and it was that better prospects for the Brazilian crop that really slowed down our pace. So, and of course, China's watching that very closely, and it looks like that's when they made a decision to slow down their purchases of U.S. beans. We're coming in right now very close to on pace for USDA's export estimate, 1.7 billion bushels. We might fall a little shy. Our shipment pace has been a little slow, but we already have enough sales to reach that export estimate. New crop sales are concerning. At the moment, they're down 45% from a year ago. And along with that, as you may know, there is a big anticipation that Brazil is going to have a record crop again this year. USDA is already estimating about a 6.2 billion bushel crop. I think there's a lot of variability in that estimate yet. And of course, it hasn't been planted yet. And John mentioned we've got some dry conditions the market's going to be watching as we get closer to planting time. The good news for our new crop sales is that the prospects for future sales has changed quite a bit. The brown line here is the FOB soybean price in Paranagua. The green line is the U.S. FOB soybean price at New Orleans in the Gulf, and both of these are for the month of October. And as you can see, over the past several weeks, U.S. soybeans have become much cheaper than Brazil's. Right now, we're close to 57 cents a bushel cheaper than the FOB price at Paranagua. And we have seen soybean sales pick up. And in fact, just this morning, we had another announcement, 4.85 million bushels of soybeans to China, 8.8 million bushels of new crop soybeans to Mexico, new crop for both of those. So with this price differential, we're once again among the cheapest in the world, and that's good news for this time of year. And of course, we're going to need that market, especially with a big harvest coming on. The crush incentive at the moment is very rich. Soybean processors continue to do very well. The value of meal and oil, which is represented by the blue line from the state of Illinois up above, has held its value very well, even though the price of soybeans have been dropping since May. So as you know, as soybeans get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, the processors just make more and more and more money. So there's no problem at the moment with demand on the crush side, and our crush activity is up just over 5% so far this season compared to a year ago. We do have concerns, though, about the future of that. Here I've labeled soybean oil's dark horizon. This takes a look at the crush incentives for the month on the board for the month of January, and that is the date when the California Air Resource Board proposal, if is passed, that is the initial date that new soybean oil suppliers or canola suppliers will be under the limitation of only being able to use 20% of their production to obtain California's tax credit. If they're an existing supplier, you have until 2028, and then you have to limit production by 20%. So the existing supply of the soybean oil, as far as going to California, still has another 3 years it'll be allowed before it gets crimped down. But unfortunately for the new crush plants coming on, if they have not yet applied and have a pathway to California that's approved, they're right from the very gun in 2025, they're going to have to be limited to 20% of their production. So I'm sure that's a big disappointment to a lot of folks. This proposal is still receiving public comments in the moment, but it looks like a very unfortunate vote of no confidence for the future of soybean oil and canola as being used as a major feedstock for renewable diesel moving forward. and that's quite unfortunate, I believe. It's been a wonderful new market, and we need this. We need profitability from the biofuel sector to counter the decade by decade loss of exports in the world, basically to Brazil and Russia. Here's a similar chart of soybeans bearish history in those years 2015 to 2020, and especially in about 2018 and 19 when we were under the gun with the tariff dispute with China. We did have some minor rallies at that time. In 2018, we saw prices rally 19% from their lows. In 2019, we saw a 25% rally from the lows. And so if we just take the smallest of the two and add that today's November soybean price of 1092 today, 1092 is that? Mm-hmm. No, that's not for November soybeans, or 918. Sorry, that's on the cash price. So if you add that 19% rally, you get a $10.92 cash price today. So again, I can't guarantee that we're going to get back that high, but it is a conservative estimate just going by previous volatility in previous years of not only bearish supply, but in this instance, we had a very tough bearish political influence going on in there as well. So again, as we approach harvest this time of year, we tend to be at our lowest prices of the year. But even though we have a big supply and big surplus, it does not mean there cannot be rally opportunities ahead. That's the main thing I'm trying to point out here. The crop insurance math for 2024, we had a February price average this year of $11.55. If you had 85% revenue protection, that gives you protection, kicks in on price roughly at $9.81, assuming you get an average yield for the year. So our current November price at $9.76 is just a nickel below that, obviously. So again, come October, when the new average comes about, we could be very close. And of course, depending on your part of the country and the yield situation you're in, there's quite a few that could collect something on the crop insurance this year. Now, soybeans, as far as looking ahead and what are the marketing opportunities, they have a shorter time window than corn does, and it's because the Brazil harvest typically kicks in late January to February, so we can start feeling price pressures in January, sometime sooner. So we have a bit of a limited window here, but we do typically see basis improvement in cash soybean prices right up until January. After January, it's kind of a crapshoot as far as the basis goes, and of course, a lot's going to depend on Brazil's weather. So this is a situation where if we get to December and January and things are looking good for Brazil, then I don't think you want to waste too much time in getting the price, whatever you can get for the soybeans. But of course, if there's problems, then that would change the story. Yep, thank you. Okay, again, similar to what I had for the corn chart, November soybeans also have a history of trading roughly plus or minus 16% above and below their one-year average. And in fact, if you go back in the past, it's difficult to find a time when November soybeans traded more than 16% below their one-year average. But actually, we're at that point right now. We're actually dipped below a little bit. If you notice in 2018 and 19, even when we had the trade dispute with China, soybean prices did not get below the 16% end on that volatility range. So just another reason, along with the pain of the unprofitability here, why soybeans should be near long-term support, even though it is possible that crop could grow as we get to November. But let's keep in mind there's a lot of damaged acres this year that aren't accounted for yet. And they're not accounted for in the prevented planting situation because at one point the acres were planted, but then maybe they got hit with wind damage or hail or flooding later. So there's still some reckoning here to do as far as damage to acres across the country. And I don't think that's really gotten a fair accounting yet. To sum up, we've been here before. We've had surpluses before. We've had surpluses bigger than this before. But we've rarely had less profitable price levels, especially in the post-ethanol era. So if there is good news, hopefully we're near the low end of the pain point here. Demand for both corn and soybeans have good prospects moving forward. Cash markets are responding to cheap prices very well, and both corn and soybeans are moving along very well at these price levels. So that gives me a little more hope that at some point when we get our focus off of harvest and just how big the production is and start getting a little more appreciation for demand, we should be able to see some modest rallies. And I'll note that even USDA has a higher average price estimate than what we're trading at right now. Even in similar times of surplus, modest rallies are normal. I don't want you to forget that. And it remains to be seen if low prices discourage Brazilian production or expansion in 24-25 or not. Earlier this year, there were some articles that came out about the pain in the farm sector in Brazil of the lower corn, especially corn prices at that time. And there's already been talk that maybe farmers in Mato Grosso won't plant or have as big of an expansion this year when it comes to planting their soybeans because of the low profitability right now. So I don't think that big 6.2 billion bushel crop is in stone just yet. There's a lot of factors at play, and hopefully some of that can swing in our favor.
All right. Well, thank you, Todd. That's really quite interesting as always. I think when we talk about I really enjoyed that chart you showed with the time about the rallies over time, that there are modest rallies even in times of surplus. It can be hard to remember that when you're just seeing them go lower and lower every day as a mentality shift.
Yeah, whenever we see a USDA report or hear estimates or anything, we're always focused on what we think we know. But we always have to remember there's an empty space gap there of plenty of things we don't know yet. And sometimes we tend to overlook that and just focus on what we know, but that's where we can get into trouble.
I know I've got a number of follow-up questions for you, but I want to remind the audience, please drop any questions you have for Todd or John Baranick in the Q&A section of Zoom. We're going to take a really quick break to bring John Baranick back on set to answer some of those questions, so drop them in the Q&A while we're bringing John back on set, and we'll be back in a minute. Welcome back, everyone. I'm DTN Farm Business Editor Katie Dellinger, and we've got the whole crew today on set. We've got DTN Lead Analyst Todd Hultman and DTN Ag Meteorologist John Baranick here, and we're here to answer your questions about the grain markets and the weather forecast. We've got a number of them in the Q&A, but I want to just remind you, I'll drop them in there, and I'll keep asking your questions and some of my own because I love this conversation that we have every time we get to do this. Guys, thanks. Thank you for coming back in studio with me.
Thanks, Katie.
Yeah.
I just love the fact that we can, talk to our customers as much as possible and also get their feedback and their questions.
And let's dive right into it. But I think the first one's for John.
Okay.
You mentioned the potential for a drier winter. Are you concerned about soil moisture in any parts of the U.S. in the spring?
I think we can be. I mean, usually La Nina helps out those in the Ohio Valley, so we should see some decent recharge there. But in terms of the snowpack potential in the north central U.S. is a pretty big question mark. And then obviously in the southern plains, where we'll be, more likely to see those drier conditions throughout the winter. Do we have anything left over for that winter wheat crop or for planting for next year? Forages down there as well. So I'm a little uncertain about it outside of the Ohio Valley. So the Ohio Valley is probably going to be okay, but everywhere else I think has question marks for going into next year. And so that'll be a big thing coming through this winter is something that we'll be keeping up with quite a bit is, are we going to get that or not?
Well, and I think there's always a lot of perennial concern out in Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma about that, where we had that really significant drought develop over that three-year stretch of La Nina. Is that a worry again?
Yeah, because then if you don't get it during the winter and spring, I mean, that's an area that doesn't get a whole lot of rain during the summertime anyway, and it's always hot out there, and so that soil moisture always runs low in the summer anyway. So that's going to be the biggest concern. And with La Nina in there for next year, it could mean some pretty big potential for heat and moisture stress as we go into next year. So obviously that's way far out there, and things can change with how things develop and everything, and we can't be 100% right. But I am concerned about the plains in particular for next year.
Philip asks, which weather models does DTN use in developing its long-term forecast? It's a little more technical as to what goes into that long-term, but it's something special that DTN does.
Right. So, I mean, we use them all, honestly. We blend every model that's out there that has, that goes that far out into the future, we use. So we use them all. We do tend to favor the European model a bit more than some of the other ones, but not always. And we change kind of the percentages of which model we're favoring by how accurate it's been. So we kind of go with who's got the hot hand at the moment. But that's only part of the equation. We also that's maybe a third of what we use. And most of what we use to do our forecasting is actually looking at past years, our analog years, or what we call them. So, but yeah, we'll, if it's out there, we'll use it.
But we have a whole team of long-range meteorologists, too,
Right.
that are responsible for creating, monitoring, and making these forecasts happen.
Correct. Yeah, those guys are way smarter than me, too. So I just get to talk to you and tell you guys what they're kind of thinking and how it might affect agriculture. But, yeah, those guys have, decades of experience of doing this, and they're very good at it, I have to say.
Okay. One more for you before we switch to markets, John. With the potential move to a more neutral condition, not La Nina, not El Nino, does that make forecasting more difficult in those scenarios?
It does. So when we were expecting La Nina to be here this summer and it wasn't, it allows for a lot more variability. When that main driver is not in the driver's seat, he's in the back seat. Steering wheel can go all over the place. So we got a lot of good variability over the summer. We had hot stretches, they didn't last too long. We had some dry periods, they didn't last too long. It got wet in some areas for a while there, but sometimes that didn't last too long either. And so, it really, mixes things up quite a bit. So yes, it does, when you're trying to nail down, are you going to be above normal, you're going to be below normal, it gets difficult with that. It makes it easier to say we should expect a lot of variability though. So that would be the other key to it.
Okay. Now, Todd, question for you. You talked a little bit at the beginning of your presentation about interest rates. Do those historically have a significant influence on demand, or will the biggest help be to farmers on lower production costs through that sort of operating note and interest expense?
Well, number one, it chases the specs out of the long side of the market. So there's a bearish influence there right off the bat. And then for the farmers that have a significant level of debt, of course, it adds to their production costs. And then if you look at it from the commercial perspective, when interest is higher, you tend not to want to hold grain for very long periods of time. So instead of a commercial coming in and buying a lot of grain at harvest time and then kind of metering out their grain to the different end users over the year, they're more apt to do it hand to mouth in a higher interest rate environment. So overall, it's an overall negative for the producer and makes it a much more difficult situation to operate in.
An economist once described interest rates to me as another brick on the load. They're maybe not the primary driver in what's influencing things, but they can definitely add weight to what farmers and producers have to deal with.
Yeah, and I'll say it once again, even though it seems like a universal policy that everybody has to deal with, it does not hit everybody the same. And for the young producers out there trying to build a business in a future, it's especially hard on their efforts.
Yep, that financial burden is difficult to deal with when you have the debt. I think it's sort of what the Federal Reserve has learned from interest rates in the past years, that not all sectors of the economy is really impacted by this, because there are a lot of large companies out there, the big blue chips, that have no debt and large cash stores, and they're making money on the interest rates rather than it having to cool down. So there's that little bit of play too. Interest rates are a blunter tool than a lot of people think they can be.
And if I could point out one more tough aspect, is many of the consumer prices that we look at in the consumer price index are really governed by the price of oil. It's an energy cost that comes out in multiple ways in the consumer price index. So the Fed has its focus on the general price level of the consumer goods we buy, but in the ag sector, we're in a deflation right now. Price is 20% below the cost of production is, it's not quite the 1930s, but it's that type of economic scenario that's being ignored while the focus is on the consumer price.
Yep. Interest rates, there's a lot going on in that. I think the meeting in Jackson Hole is either today or this week, getting ready for all of those announcements ahead of potentially a rate cut in September. We'll have to see how all of that plays out. I don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah, unfortunately, I just think it's going to be a slow process coming down, and that makes it tough maybe for another year ahead.
Okay, Todd, here's an interesting question from Robert. He wants to know, why are commercials long on so many grains?
Well, number one, they're finding terrific value here. As you looked at the ethanol charts and the crush incentives, there's a lot of great things you can do to make money off of cheap grain. And so they're basically tying up profitable opportunities, and typically they're always taking the other side of what the non-commercials are driving. So at this end of the very cheap price spectrum, they're finding lots of places where it's profitable to take that cheap grain and turn it into something else or send it somewhere else.
Okay, makes a lot of good sense. Another good question from the viewers out there. Please send any questions you have in the Q&A now. This is our last one we have queued up. After that, it's my questions. Okay, so this question says, when would we expect the FOB advantage on U.S. beans to begin to fall away as we contemplate sales into March, April?
Yeah, typically about January as the Brazil harvest comes closer and closer. And sometimes that'll come a little earlier and sometimes a little later, depending on the expectations of that Brazilian crop. But that's basically the window that we have, is right up till early January.
Let's talk a little more about Brazil altogether, because right now we're going into our fall harvest. That's where our producers' attention is. But right after that, it's all Brazil for 4 or 5 months. That's all we're really watching, is their planting, their production, their weather. It sounded like it's going to be a drier year, a warm year for them. What do you guys think is, what's your crystal balls saying?
Well, I mean, even when we had La Niñas, soybean production down there was still pretty big. And a lot of that, I think, had to do with expansion of acres and stuff too. But central Brazil still gets a lot of good weather, even during La Niñas. Even when it's drier than normal down there, it's still really good weather in central Brazil for soybeans. So soybean production, I don't think that'll be an issue in Brazil. Argentina might have an issue with it though, especially if those drier conditions really show up at that peak time there late in their summer, and that could really have a big issue for them. For corn, it's kind of the opposite. Maybe not for Argentina. It's probably a bigger concern down there. But the weather for them for corn is a little bit more concerning, because they have just such a short window there where they can harvest their soybeans, plant that corn, and then try to get it through the pollination period while the rains are still falling. So they really pray for that. And if La Niña has its way and shortens up that window, it could really spell big things for corn. And we did see that during those La Niña years. Sometimes it's central Brazil that gets the worst of it. Sometimes it's southern Brazil, but it's somewhere. And then there's always a risk of frost too. So if they're pushing their planting date for soybeans back, that pushes their corn planting back, and then they run into possibly June, where the crop is still growing, and at that time they can start to get some frost in southern Brazil. We saw that on a couple occasions back in 21, I believe. So that was a big hit to their corn crop. So there's always something that can happen in terms of the weather. But I mean, for soybeans, it's hard to do, especially in Brazil. But corn, it's easier for weather to affect them. I don't know what you have to say about that, Todd.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, it was just last year, they had hot and dry threat early in Brazil for the soybeans especially. And we got a bit of a bump in our soybean price. And it was also at a time when our export window was active. So you can get kind of a double lift there coming out of a harvest low. And that would be a nice gift in this situation if we could experience that again. But, it's all up to John how the weather turns out.
But I think to John's point, the impacts on the corn market are really important to note there too, that if they, because that corn acreage can only expand as fast as the soybean acreage. And, if that's constrained more, that could really influence the corn price.
And the nice thing about corn is you have longer before that South American threat starts to weigh on the market because their corn is planted after the soybeans. It's several, it's July basically when the early harvest or the safrinha harvest starts to come in. So you've got easily up until April typically before a big threat in the corn price starts to happen.
But it'll be something that we monitor next winter and February as we're looking at that crop insurance guarantee price and all of those things. There's like what's happening in Brazil can really influence our crop insurance here in the United States.
Yeah, true.
Yep, risk management. Those are all our questions from the audience. So I am going to switch to a little bit of my own. And I want to share with you all, if you have not seen Todd's column from last Friday, that he is indeed retiring from DTN, or at least from full-time grains analysis here. He's going to be helping us out for a little bit while longer, getting us through the farm show season, which I know is Todd and John's favorite things to do. They love going out to these events. Where are you guys going to be this spring?
You seem like
or this summer,
sarcastic
fall.
About that.
No,
I love going.
No, I've actually never been because we've got so many people on staff to go. I've not been to Farm Progress or Husker Harvest Days, but
you got to come.
Yeah. What are you guys looking forward to at these events this year?
I just love talking to farmers. I mean, it's getting my stuff out of the house, part of it. And getting some fresh air, that's always great. But, talking to farmers, how did the weather actually impact them this year? Getting to, have a little intimate moment about, how are things going for you? And, are you getting the information you need? What could I be doing better? That sort of thing. So I always love interacting with those guys out there at the farm shows.
Same for me. I mean, it's the best feedback in the world just to spend time talking with farmers. And I always love how they have a kind of a gossip network of where the best prices are around, who's offering the best on the corn or beans at the time. And last year it was the ethanol plants and the livestock guys that were really bidding the prices up. And I just find it fascinating, all the nooks and crannies sometimes that go under the radar that can be great opportunities for them that we don't even know about sometimes.
That's always interesting what you learn when you talk to farmers. They really do know.
Oh, yeah.
Now, at these farm shows, John, what do you expect the weather to be like? I know at Farm Progress, it's usually a foot of rain and deep in mud, or it's 100 degrees and hot as blazes.
Yeah, probably hotter this year. I don't know if it will be too bad because it's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of next week in Boone, Iowa. And so I don't know. The models have not been very great beyond the next 7 days. I'll say that. For the last, approximately the last month, it's been really hard to trust them. They seem to want to think that a couple of cold fronts are going to move through next week, but they don't know at what time or to what degree. And so it's like, I don't know. It's just going to be hot. I'll just might get it. And if it's not so hot, I'll just be like thankful. Oh, that'd be great. So I don't have to
expect
sweat
the
out there.
worst and
Yeah.
pray for the best. And when it's not that bad, it's great. Yeah. So Todd, I want to hand it to you and ask you a little bit. What are some of your parting thoughts for our audience, or things to consider or take away as you're leaving and they're continuing on their farming journeys? What do you want them to think about and remember?
Yeah, well, I started just as the markets were starting to break in the 1980s, in the mid 1980s. And here we are, come around full circle again, but it's not just been one circle, it's been many, many full circles along the way. And it just never seems to get easier when you get down to these painful price levels. But I always say, and it's not just blowing smoke, but surprises happen. You just never know what's going to be around the corner. And just think, just not that long ago, how bleak things looked during the summer of COVID. We didn't know if we'd have demand for corn. People quit driving. The ethanol just went to the tubes. And we were talking about the possibility of 3 billion bushels. And then here pops up a flash drought out of nowhere. And here comes China buying a lot more corn and beans than most people expected. You just never know. And so don't ever get, my take is, don't ever get too confident on the things you don't know or the things you do know, because whatever you think you do know is probably a tiny raindrop in the world of things we don't know. And so don't let that hope go out just as we go through these tough times.
There's always things we don't see or we can't see. We're
Yeah.
not in a position to see.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, John, Todd, thank you so much for joining me in the studio here for this discussion on the weather and the markets. We're going to take another quick break. I'm going to bring on DTN's editor-in-chief, Greg Horstmeyer, for a little analysis and wrap-up of everything we've talked about today, as well as some discussions on what's new in the future of DTN. Stay tuned. Welcome back. I'm DTN Farm Business Editor Katie Dellinger. With me right now is DTN Editor-in-Chief Greg Horstmeyer, my boss, the one and only. How are you doing today, Greg?
Great, and a great webinar this morning. And really, this one, as we always are happy to do these and proud of what the team puts together. But some great information both from John and from Todd in terms of what we're facing in the next couple of months.
There are a couple of charts I'm going to take from their presentations, and I don't know if I'll report on them or I'll use them as information in my reporting. But the ones John showed about sort of when the rainy season starts and ends in La Nina years in Brazil, I thought was really interesting. Yeah. And the influence La Nina plays on that window is something I'll look at again more in depth. But also those charts Todd showed of corn and soybeans from 2014 to 2019, and how even when we're in surplus situations, there can still be rallies to prices that are at or above the cost of production.
Yeah, and I think that's something we talk an awful lot around here, and we work on really hard with the alerts that we send to our customers and things like that. But paying attention, I mean, it's not the first time that it's been said, but this is going to be one of those marketing years where I think, as Todd said, we have the chance for some surprises. We're going to have to be watching for those, and we're going to have to pounce on them when they happen. Yeah.
Right, and thing with the surprise, you never know when it's going to be.
Right.
So you've just got to be prepared.
Yeah, and thinking about when those best opportunities are, as Todd talked about, in early spring, when usually in these kind of conditions, we should have some marketing opportunities, but really being prepared to jump when they arise. Mm-hmm.
Now, I know you hired Todd as DTN's lead analyst back. He was on our analyst team, and you gave him the promotion.
Right. Yeah. Just a note about that. I mean, Todd's hand on the tiller for the last many years has been fabulous for the analyst team. I know he's been highly regarded by our customers when we have those farm shows, as you guys were just talking about, that are coming up. The questions that come in, the people that come in to visit with him, and John and others. But Todd will hopefully get a good chance to spend some time with people, and we're certainly happy and proud of the work that he's done here, and working on bringing in the next Todd. That's going to be both big shoes to fill and an interesting time to do it in as we move into this cycle of the market, of the markets right now. So we're looking for a great experienced person, and there'll be some news on that shortly.
Well, let's hope we find a really great candidate for that, because I know this is a time when the best information and helpful information goes a long way.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and that's what we want to continue to be known for. I laugh that Todd said that he hopes to take some time to do some trading again because as some of the folks know out there, but maybe many of you don't, we don't allow our analysts to trade so that we can keep that neutrality. It's part of what we try to do to provide transparency in the information that we provide. So he's looking forward to getting back out and taking a little risk again. So
You know, I'm really glad you brought that up because I think in general, not very many people understand that most journalists work under a code of ethics that varies based on their organization and their industry. And we have a pretty robust one, and that is actually something you are very big into professionally.
Right, it really is. It's a big part of what we do, and we have probably in the industry have one of the most robust. Toughest is probably true as well, but we hold everyone to a high standard here, and that's what our customers pay for.
And I think one of the things you're working on right now are some guidelines, not to bring in a totally far left topic, around AI and artificial intelligence,
right.
And how we use those in our DTN operations.
Yeah, the whole idea of generative AI and creating content is something that newsrooms across the world are working on, and both trying to keep control of our content, in terms of what we do and how that's being used by AI systems that are outside our company, but also how we use it internally to speed up some of the things that we have to do, but make some of that work a little bit faster, guarantee the accuracy in terms of numbers so that we don't, accidentally, keystroke a wrong number in there. There's some real advantages to some of that, but it has to be done in a way that is both transparent and also has a high degree of a high touch on the human side, because that's what we've really invested a lot in here. Yeah.
And that really is the way our code of ethics works. You have to do the reporting and the work. It's part of our existing code of ethics. So I don't think AI would change us too much.
No, not at all. Not at all.
So just a little aside there.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about that as an industry, and that's going to continue to be a conversation with our customers too. What do they expect from us, and how do they want to be told about what we're doing, or do they care about what's happening behind the scenes? Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about what the DTN newsroom is working on, what's ahead, what's kind of in our
right.
future
So
here.
just as we are doing this today, in fact, going up, if it's not up on the systems right now, it's going to go up pretty quickly. It'll just take the electrons time to get there. Is some breaking news on EPA's latest statement on the Environmental Species Act. Our crops editor, Jason Jenkins, is working on that story. We've got the announcement that the information is out and that a document is out. He's pouring through that right now, and we'll have continued coverage on that through the day. As a lot of our customers know, the Environmental Species Act and how that plays out in terms of pesticides is probably one of the biggest issues that sort of hangs out there in agriculture. We are always concerned about Clean Water Act rules and various pesticide rules, but the Environmental Species Act and the unsurety about that and the long time that we've spent as a nation trying to get those rules figured out is always a bit of a worry on the horizon. And so we'll continue to follow that through, and also the other big thing I think that you'll see more of is just watching this crop as it comes through. Last week, as Katie's mentioned, we had our digital yield tour, our 7th annual digital yield tour, and a new twist for us, just using some proprietary DTN software in our crop models, and went really, really well. Katie was a big part of making sure that happened well. So I would encourage readers that information is still available. I encourage you to look at those. We know we've got a physical crop tour going on this week. And so as those numbers coming in, compare those to what we found from the satellites and other parts of the model last week. And we'll continue to follow that as the crop goes through, because that's the big question is, how big will this crop be? Will it continue to stay some of those record numbers that we saw?
People really do like to look at the ear count, ear length, ear kernel data that comes out in the September and October NASS crop production report. So it's actually field level survey data. So that's a little bit more of the real counting kernels, as I would call it, versus the guesstimating and the ideas. So that's something that we're going to be watching a lot in the next month,
all through
2 months
harvest.
going forward.
Absolutely.
Yep. Yeah. And then before we know it, it'll be December and the new year, and by early December, we'll be back here for another Ag Summit Series webinar, where we'll probably be talking a little bit about the election in that one, a little bit about some of the commodity markets and some business and potentially some land issues in there as well.
Yeah, so I encourage everyone to stay focused and pay attention to some of the announcements that we'll have about those events. And I also want to remind everybody that this one will be rebroadcast. As we were on the air this morning, we had several people ask about, hey, can I watch this later? And so we know that a lot of you do that. And that's one of the great things about this format, is you can come back and look at it again later, or share it with somebody else on your team that couldn't, whoever was out doing the chores this morning while you were in watching this.
Yep. And we know that Nick Scalise, our technical expert, usually puts timestamps on there, so you can watch the parts that are really important to you if you want that information again. So I think, Greg, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks
and thank you
for
everyone
hosting
in the audience for watching, attending, for asking your questions and participating. We really do love bringing our news and content and information to you in this more interactive format. It's something we look forward to every few months when we host these Ag Summit Series events. So with that, I want to say thank you for attending. Have a great afternoon and a prosperous harvest.
Be safe out there.